Good evening, everyone. My name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression. And I'd like to welcome you to tonight's panel. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I am welcoming you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home of many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. This evening's panel discussion is the fifth in the CFE's virtual forum series. The title is "It Time to Re-examine the Limits on Free Expression in the Workplace." The format for tonight's discussion is as follows. In a few minutes, I'm going to be introducing the panelists, and you'll see each of them as they're being introduced. After about 45 minutes of discussion amongst the panel, we'll turn to the audience for questions. If you would like to ask a question, what you should do is move your cursor to the bottom of your screen, and you'll see a Q&A button. At any time during the program, and I'll remind you about 10 minutes before we actually get to audience questions, at any time you can write a question, and that question will go to the center's coordinator, Ange Holmes, who, when it's time to turn to the audience for questions, I'll turn to her and ask her to read the first of the questions we get. We'll just deal with the questions as they come up. Now, you'll also notice next to the Q&A button, a chat button, and I do not use that one. It's disabled under this software. Now, this panel discussion and the Q&A will be recorded, and a recording of that will be posted on the center's website. The center's website is cfe.ryerson.ca, cfe.ryerson.ca, and you can find the podcast for this one. It'll be up tomorrow, and any of our previous ones, either on our podcast page on the website or on our events page. I'd like to, finally, before we start, express appreciation to Ange Holmes, who I mentioned previously, who's the center's coordinator and does an incredible amount of work to make these panels possible, and to Brian Bowes and Luke Nader, who are with Ryerson University's Media Services. Their technical expertise has been and continues to be invaluable for these programs. Our sixth panel will be a week from tomorrow, next Wednesday, June 10th at 2 p.m. It's likely to be quite a controversial panel. The title of it is Fighting Anti-Semitism or Silencing Critics of Israel. What's behind the push for governments to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism? So if you are interested in that, please join us next Wednesday, June 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And now for our panel for today. Let me introduce our panelists. The first is David Hutton. David serves as a trustee and is one of the founders of the Whistleblowing International Network, and he is a senior fellow of the Center for Free Expression. He chaired the board and was the executive director of the former Federal Accountability Initiative for Reform, FAIR, which was a charity, principal charity at the time in Canada, devoted to whistleblower protection. He is also an author of several books and a former management consultant, recognized as an expert in management systems and organizational change. Welcome, David. Our second panelist is Danielle Mclaughlin. Danielle told me that she's been a civil liberties advocate since she was old enough to say, "That's not fair." As the director, as she was for many years, as the director of education for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and Education Trust. She did that from 1988 to 2016. She worked closely with the late Alan Borovoy and developed programs and resources to help teachers and students think critically about their rights and freedoms. Danielle is the author of That's Not Fair, Getting to Know Your Rights and Freedoms, which is published by Kids Can Press as their 2016 Citizen Kid book for children in grades 2 to 6. It's never too young to start teaching kids about their rights to freedom of expression. She's also the co-author with her son, Reuben Mclaughlin, of That's Not Fair website videos for children ages 7 to 11. Welcome, Danielle. Our third panelist is Charles Smith. Charles is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan. He is also a senior fellow at the Center for Free Expression. His work is in Canadian and international political economy, public law, labor unions, and federal and provincial public policy. His latest project with a colleague, Danielle Mclaughlin, examines the interconnection between workers' freedom of expression, social media, and workplace discipline in Canada. Charles is co-editor of Canada's foremost labor studies journal, Labor Le Travail. Welcome, Charles.
Nice to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure for me to be able to moderate such a wonderful panel. So I'd like to begin, when Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms recognizes freedom of expression as a fundamental freedom for all of us. That right does not necessarily extend into the workplace. A high-profile example that many of our listeners may recall was the question of what happened to the firing of Don Cherry, whom the CBC fired because they were unhappy with his expression. So, Charles, just to help us get started, could you tell us a little bit more about the extent of an employee's or a worker's free expression rights in the workplace?
Thanks, Jim, and it's nice to be here and with such an esteemed panel. I'm quite humbled to be on a panel with both of you. We started doing this project with this sort of idea of thinking about what it means to be able to speak your mind in a free society. And one of the things we noticed, and it perhaps has always been true, but it seems to be intensified in the past 15 years, is that our speech has been amplified by sort of modern communications. And we started seeing a lot of stories about workers being disciplined in various ways. And one of the things that Danielle and I noticed was that there was this sort of blurring of the relationship between our private lives as workers and our public lives as citizens. And the short answer to your question, as we started digging into this work, Jim, is that workers have almost no rights in the workplace when it comes to their ability to speak out. Now, I say almost none.
I mean, okay, no, I mean, it's that serious.
Well, almost none in the sense that if you're in a union environment, the union has the capacity through its collective agreement to defend workers, and that gives you some protection. But as your audience will know, vast majority of workers in Canada are not protected by a union. And having none of that protection means that what you say will always be, the employer will always have the ability to police that. And if they don't like it, you can be dismissed.
So, I mean, what you're saying is if I'm in a workplace, unless there's a collective agreement or I have a personal contract that gives me some expression rights, I essentially have none. And if the employer doesn't like something I've said, I can just be let go?
For the most part, I mean, there could be human rights issues, but at the end of the day, and again, that would be a lengthy litigated process and likely you wouldn't get your job back. So I think it's safe to say that if you're in a non-union environment, you have almost no rights in the workplace when it comes to your ability to speak out.
Well, that's pretty, why is that? How do we come to that? I mean, in a society where, our courts and our Constitution, our Charter put such a high value on freedom of expression, how does our common law come to essentially put no value on it in the workplace?
Well, I mean, how much time do we have to talk about the history of capitalism, I guess, would be one of the questions. But
I'm not asking you that.
But, in our system, the state is very much, built around a system of law that's tied to private property, and private property tends to be the filter through which the workplace is constructed and the way the state regulates it. Now, it's different in the public sector employee, and I know this will be getting into the discussion, is that in some ways, public employees are even more restricted, and we'll talk more about that. But the relation between a private sector employer and a worker has always been one of contract. There's been this form of commodification or capitalism that, workers tend to have very little rights when it comes to their abilities to do certain things. And, and certainly in the union is a way to sort of mitigate some of those tensions, but not perfect in protecting workers. So there's all kinds of relationships in the rights between an employer and a worker that's navigated through the economic system that makes it very difficult for workers to have anything bearing an equality when it comes to workplace, to rights in the workplace.
When I was preparing for this tonight, Charles, I was looking at in one management law firm's advice to employers. And they wrote, and it's just 3 lines. And if you could comment on it, it says the employer's right to manage the workplace is given effect in law through a series of implied contractual duties that the employee owes to the employer, such as the duties of obedience, loyalty, fidelity, good faith, and confidence.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you've done a lot of work looking at arbitrations and so on. I mean,
Sure.
Is that a fair generalization about the restrictions that an employee faces?
So I would disagree with how management lawyers like to talk about the relationship between workers and their employers. And that sounds like it could have been written by a lawyer during the great reign of Queen Victoria. In sort of the relationship between what we owe our employers, as if somehow the employment relationship is benevolent and that they're giving us these things. But really, that's not wrong. I mean, when you look at the employment rules that management lawyers dictate to the employers, is like the best way to head off any problems is to have policies that restrict as much as possible the ability of employees to speak out. And they know if they do, there are ways to easily be disciplined. The duty of loyalty at law is a very strange one, and in my mind, a very dated one, especially as we're seeing the blurring of the relationships between what we do at work. In the 1950s, or 60s, if you were angry at your boss and you went to a pub with a friend and you sort of, talked about your anger and you sort of sounded off that way, there would be almost no repercussion. Today, if you tweet that out or if you put us on Facebook or put a picture on Instagram, it's going to be seen. And that blurring of that relationship is what we're really starting to see the significance of workers being disciplined in really egregious ways.
We're going to come back to the whole issue of how this is changing with social media in a few minutes, if that's okay. Danielle, I'd like to turn to you now. Most of your work has been talking about the freedom of expression for students and also for teachers. I'd like to focus on the teachers part of it at the moment. To what extent are these kinds of restrictions the reality of teachers' lives in school? Let's just talk about the school part of it. I mean, presumably there's some good reasons why teachers have restrictions on, they're dealing with young children and so forth. Would you talk a little bit about teachers' free expression rights? Because in school, they're supposed to also be modeling democracy, or schools are supposed to be modeling democracy.
So that's really where the collision occurs, I think, Jim. You have an obligation to teach your children, your students, to think critically, and yet you are also being instructed to keep to have no opinion, to not express your views on political or religious or any kind of controversial topic. Well, how do you do both? And the answer is you can't. So you have to figure out ways in which you can encourage your kids, your students, to get engaged in, highly topical issues without actually engaging in your own views. Now, it's pretty hard to be a teacher and not be a human being at the same time. And last I looked, most teachers tend to be human beings. They also tend to have points of view, because as human beings, we have these things. The question that we're constantly being asked is, how far is too far? What can you safely express? And of course, it changes over time, and it changes by location. It changes from school to school. So teachers are in a really rough spot. They don't know. I've heard of teachers who have been cautioned by principals for saying things that other teachers would have thought were totally innocuous. Mm-hmm. And then, you hear how long it takes to get a teacher out of the profession when they do something totally egregious.
Right.
The one thing that the charter is lovely, and we really appreciate the fact that we have charter protections. They only protect you from government. So, if you look at Section 1, I happen to be, a kind of I don't know if I'm an admirer of Section 1 of the
Could you
Charter.
explain what Section 1 says?
Yes, Section 1 of the Charter may be the most Canadian thing on earth. It says, excuse me, before we tell you what your rights and freedoms are, we're going to be limiting them. But don't worry, because it's always going to be reasonable. This is the Section 1. It doesn't even tell you what rights you have. It says, however, you've got this, you know, before we get to them, every one of your rights and freedoms will be subject to reasonable limits as demonstrably justified by law in a free and democratic society. So if you ask somebody, what does reasonable mean? You're going to get 100,000 different responses to that. So what I've done and what I've been working with teachers particularly is to try to get them to understand, you know, how we make as a society decisions about what is and what isn't reasonable, knowing that we will disagree. And, you know, this is one of, in my view, one of the great things about living in a democracy is we're set up to disagree. You know, we need to learn how to do it civilly and non-violently. But, you know, now that we realize that our charter has set us up to disagree, knowing that reasonable will change over time, that we aren't, you know, and that who decides what's reasonable will also change over time. Teachers really need to engage at that level with their students. So, you know, I say that when you start making rules for your kindergarten class, you have to be looking at what does it mean to live in a democracy? You know, if we have a rule that says, you know, don't pinch the kid in the next desk, any kid worth his salt is going to ask you why, you know, and your answer will probably be because, you know, you probably don't want to be pinched by him, you know, or by her. So we start having an understanding at a very early age. But when we look at teachers in the workplace, particularly, or other school administrators, we see that their expression rights are limited wildly, and many of them, who, at least those who teach in public schools, are in fact government employees.
So could you give an example of some of the kinds of rights that people may not think about?
Sure.
Do you have any?
There are many examples, but I mean, the cases that are best known, for example, one of the cases is Malcolm Ross. Malcolm Ross was a middle grade math teacher in New Brunswick. And by all accounts, he was a relatively good math teacher. Kids succeeded in his class. He had a hobby. And his hobby was that in his spare time, he wrote Holocaust denial pamphlets and booklets. He, you know, believed there was a communist Jewish Freemason banker conspiracy out to rule the world. And he wrote about this, but he didn't bring it into the classroom because he was teaching math. So they said it wasn't relevant. He said it wasn't relevant. And the question arose, should somebody who publishes, because he was publishing this stuff, be permitted to continue to teach in a classroom? Some people said he should have the right to freedom of expression. He's not harming children. That was one of the tests. Other people said, of course he's harming children, you know, because teachers need to be held to a higher level of account, and that because teachers are considered to be role models, they should not be permitted to do things that in general aren't considered to be acceptable in society, including holding anti-Semitic views. People said, well, you know, there are very few Jewish people living in this town in New Brunswick. We shouldn't worry about it. And I don't know if you remember, there was a brand of bread that used to, it was called Levy's Jewish Rye. And their slogan was, you don't have to be Jewish to love Levy's. And I always used to say, you don't have to be Jewish to think very strongly about Malcolm Ross. You know, I'm sure that many people felt extremely uncomfortable knowing that he was teaching their children as a role model. And he had gone on, you know, the local cable television network to talk about, you know, what he believed and stuff. So he ended up, after many trials and tribulations, and went to the Supreme Court. First, they moved him to the library. Then they moved him into administration, of course. And then finally, he lost his teaching certificate. And he's still railing about it. He still feels that his freedom of expression has been unreasonably limited. At the other
Okay,
end,
yeah, so I mean, in that example, it wasn't expression in the school. It was
exactly.
expression outside. Are there examples of teachers' limitations on their expression in school?
Oh, plenty. And much of that has to do with showing children inappropriate films. Things like wearing protest clothing. So there in BC, there was a protest from the teachers that they wore Yertle the Turtle t-shirts. And I think Yertle the Turtle says something like, I know that you have the sites are wonderful up where, you know, up where in the great heights, but even down here, we too have rights. And it shows a bunch of turtles all piled up on top of each other. And of course, the bottom turtles are being squashed by the king of the turtles, Yertle, who was actually, I believe, modeled after Stalin. But, you know, so these teachers were punished for wearing those shirts. But
Was this taken as a protest against their school board?
oh yes, that's,
Yeah,
and it
okay.
was meant to be too.
Yeah.
And there have been others, you know, protests just about classroom size, and people have said teachers should never talk about, you know, what they're striking about. You know, if there's, you know, in Ontario, teachers have been on alternating strikes before all of this happened for quite a while. Some people have said, you know, you will be disciplined if you tell your students why you're walking out. And other people have said, you better tell your students why you're walking out. It's important.
What happens to those? I mean, have there been cases where people
I
have
don't know
told
if
their
there's
students?
any disciplinary hearings about the most recent Ontario ones. There certainly were in British Columbia about that and other FSA
Right.
stuff. So, you know, it happens all the time. And teachers are disciplined for example, in certain schools, if it's learned that a teacher has talked about abortion, they could be fired because it's considered, you know, inappropriate to talk to students about this. And and many people know.
Even in a sex ed class?
Yeah.
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 Okay, well, David, I have a question for you. You know, in a sense, you've spent a good deal of your recent adult life dealing with issues of whistleblowers. And we're in the midst of a terrible pandemic right now. And in some ways, the limits on workplace free expression probably couldn't be clearer than in the case where a worker sees some wrongdoing or sees something wrong or some harm that is befalling the public, but feels they have no right to speak about it. You know, in Ontario, we have a huge number of deaths in nursing homes, and there's obvious problems there. To what extent are people's fears about speaking out about these things, fears they'll be fired, are they justified? I mean, isn't there some protection in Canadian law or in organizational policies that would protect an employee where they see wrongdoing or harm that reports it, and if it isn't dealt with, reports it publicly?
Well, you would certainly hope so, and many Canadians would believe so, given that, you know, our view of our own country. But the reality is that there's essentially no protection in Canada for whistleblowers, and this is not a defensible situation because we're one of the worst countries in the developed world in this regard.
I mean, in terms of our whistleblower protection or lack thereof?
That's correct. We have a system that's been in place since 2007. It's cost tens of millions of dollars to run. It's created 2 new agencies, and over 1,000 whistleblowers have approached it.
Now, what level is this in Ontario or federally or what?
I'm sorry, this is the federal system.
Okay.
I say over 1,000 people have approached it with concerns, reported wrongdoing and so on. And in those 13 years, not a single whistleblower has been protected. Only a handful have.
In our whole federal service, not a single whistleblower has been protected.
That's correct, yeah.
13 years.
Yeah.
I mean, in other jurisdictions, how many whistleblowers would you expect given the size of our federal civil service? Is there any estimate of what the experience in other countries might be?
Oh gosh, well, if we look at the UK, for example, they have a single law that protects essentially everybody in the UK workforce. And that allows people to seek a remedy if they suffer reprisals. And the success rate there is about 20%. So about 20% of the people who feel that they've suffered reprisals go to that system, and they get redress. Our success rate is very, very close to zero. As to how many people may want to blow the whistle, it's hard to put numbers on that, but I mean, when I was working with FAIR, as you mentioned, I ran a hotline for some time, and I had more than 400 people contact me, in spite of the fact there's very, very little we could do for them, given the legislative situation and so on. And there are many, many more out there who wouldn't know about us, and so that was more than 100 a year. And I think the out there, the people that wouldn't approach us or would not find out about us would be orders of magnitude greater than that.
So, I mean, if we're talking about in this current circumstance, those people who are working in long-term care facilities, they really have no protection. If they see anything and report it, they could be fired. Absolutely.
It's worse than being fired. Our experience is that when people come forward with information that's embarrassing to management, especially if it relates to corruption or incompetence, something serious, then what happens is basically the sky falls on them. Management will orchestrate reprisals that not only render them unemployed, but unemployable. It will destroy their ability to work in their chosen profession, or ruin them financially, cause the immense psychological harm because of the kind of cruel treatment they get. And very often they lose the family home. Very often the family itself fractures because of the extreme stress they put under. So it's really an extremely daunting prospect, and yet people still come forward.
Well, I mean, when Charles was talking about the absence of rights in the workplace, I guess this is about as dramatic and extreme as they can be, that even where you see something that's wrong or illegal or going to harm the public, you still don't have a right protected by law to say it, to speak it, to bring it forward.
That's right.
Charles, you were mentioning to me when we were preparing for this about a case in Saskatchewan of a nurse who raised concerns about what was happening to her father in long-term care. This wasn't even in her workplace. Can you tell us about that? Because that raises another aspect of how broadly the restrictions on workplace free expression can be. So it's not only in your own workplace, but it can be in relation to a workplace with which you might be associated. Could you tell us about Carolyn Strom?
Yeah, so Carolyn Strom is a nurse in Saskatchewan, and I think is an incredibly courageous woman who sort of shone a bright light on the quality of care in long-term care facilities, which of course is so important in the age of COVID-19. But what's interesting about Ms. Strom is that she posted on Facebook a fairly innocuous message about the quality that her grandfather had received at a long-term care facility. And I have to say, if you were to read this, and if your readers were to, sorry, if our listeners were to read it, you wouldn't be shocked by it, right? It was really a type of post that you probably read quite often.
Could you give us a sense of what she said?
Well, she said something, and again, I can't quote.
Yeah, I mean, paraphrasing.
But it was something like, listen, a lot of you did really great, and thank you for that. Some of you, we need to do better, right? My grandfather could have done better, and we were really, that we were upset about certain things. And I don't even think it was upset. It was more like, we just need to do better, right? Again, nothing offensive, certainly not to the degree of whistleblowing, right? More just saying like, there were some things that worked and some things that didn't. And, and I was thinking when Danielle was saying about the charter is that, she would post this and then the controversy exploded and people would say, what about the charter? And I think there's a general perception, and certainly some of my students when I teach in the charter era talk about how they're surprised that the charter doesn't apply to these areas. They think it does, and then often, we hear it doesn't, which is something we might want to talk about. But so in Strom's case, this post went viral, as they say. And word got around that she was a nurse, and a bunch of nurses at that long-term care facility complained about her conduct, saying this was sort of bringing a black eye on the profession. and ended up that she was disciplined not by the employer where she worked, but by the sort of regulatory body that sort of governs nursing in Saskatchewan. And it's still ongoing several years later. There's been some initial decisions to discipline her. The Union of Nurses here in Saskatchewan has defended her. She lost before the board. It's now gone to court, and we're awaiting some rulings there. But here you have an example of someone who I think is trying to shine a light on a system that has many problems, as we know. And her speech is being radically curtailed by the regulatory body because they see it as a problem in a profession that demands silence and not public discussion. And I think Ms. Strom was very brave to continue that fight. I really admire her bravery in doing so, but at the same time, it shines a light on the limits of workers having the capacity to even talk about issues in workplaces that may not even be theirs.
So what, I mean, what kind of penalty did she get? They just tell her don't do that again? Or
there's quite a large fine that, to the credit of the Saskatchewan Union of Nurses, they paid. There was a fundraising campaign. The Saskatchewan Union of Nurses, to my knowledge, and I'm sure your listeners can correct me if I'm wrong, defended her legally, and then there was a crowdsourcing campaign to help her pay her fees to the regulatory body, which again seems egregious, right? That she's forced to pay for a very innocuous comment about the quality of care that someone that she loved and cared for received in a long-term care facility.
I mean, when I looked at it, I think she was fined $25,000. Or she had to pay $25,000 for that Facebook post.
That's right.
That's staggering.
No, and it was, and again, what that reflects to me is a shot across the bow by the regulatory body that every nurse needs to be quiet, right? Because this is what will happen. That the size of that fine is clearly meant as a warning to anyone else who might do something like this, because it's so high for any one person to handle. That this is a warning saying you are not to discuss what happens in care facilities across the province. And without that union support, I don't know if Ms. Strom would have been able to go on. Certainly that's helped, but I mean, I think her tenacity alone is worth admiring. And it borders up against some of the things that David was saying about whistleblowing, right? I can only imagine the stress that she's been under to do so. But this is not an only occurrence. This happens quite a bit.
David, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I think that if you have places like the Ontario College of Teachers and other colleges of teachers, which are both the disciplinary body and the body that lays out guidelines for your behavior, you can be in some difficulty. And when I was looking at the guidelines the Ontario College of Teachers sets out for expression, particularly use of media, internet, social media, they say, keep it generic, make sure you don't do this, make sure you don't do that, which totally, clamps down on teachers' expression. And then they are also the body that would discipline. So, it seems to me there's a kind of potential conflict in a space like that.
I mean, you live in Ontario, as do I, Danielle.
Yeah.
And Ontario does have a college of teachers that.
Well, BC got rid of its college.
That's right. So, I mean, can you give an example of the kind of case, do you recall a case where it went before the College of Teachers, which would have an impact on teachers' free expression rights?
The thing is that they don't always, the blue pages, which are the pages where they describe discipline, tend to be disciplines where disciplinary actions where teachers have committed an impropriety with a student,
Right. Yeah.
But,
well, I mean, that's not an expression.
That doesn't mean there isn't a chilling effect.
Well, but I mean, I remember a case in Ontario a few years ago in the midst of a provincial election.
Right.
The vice president of the Ontario Teachers Federation, which is the umbrella organization of the teachers federations in Ontario, and it exists to lobby and to engage in representing teachers' interests during elections, had spoken critically about the ex-premier and the record of his party and what it had meant for schools. And one of his constituents filed a complaint with the Ontario College of Teachers. So here, the vice president of the democratic body that is to expressly exist to lobby and do political activity on behalf of teachers.
But if you look at
There was a complaint filed against him, and instead of dropping it,
yeah.
they launched an investigation that could have gone on for a year or so into this teacher.
But was he disciplined at the end of the story?
Well, what happened at the end of this story is there was no way to stop it in terms of their process, and that the presidents of the 4 teachers federations in the province met with the premier and said there's going to be a war unless you get this pulled. And so it was only that extraordinary action that led to it being pulled. And
you know, and people often comfort themselves when they say, well, you know, in the end he wasn't disciplined, but he had to go through all of the investigation and all of the acrimony around that. And as you say, David, you know, this is the kind of thing that can ruin people, even if it doesn't end up any place, you know, that significant. It's you know, it's like people will say when a criminal charge is dropped, oh well, you know, justice works. Well,
that's right. And I'd just like to add that this applies across many professions where there are obligations. We're talking about teachers, nurses, doctors, engineers, all kinds of people have professional obligations that are laid on them to protect the public, to report misconduct, those types of things. And the professional bodies can be quite heavy-handed in enforcing those. But when people respect those duties and speak up about something that's wrong and suffer reprisals, the professional bodies are nowhere to be seen. That's the pattern that we see.
Well, I think you see that with teachers, because they're explicitly told, you know, not to say negative things about their colleagues or the system, you know, or the school in which they teach. So if and at the same time, you have an obligation to report mistreatment of students. So what do you do?
Well, I mean, as we saw in Carolyn Strom's case, although the regulatory body for nurses has rules to protect the public, they actually are rules that prevent the public from hearing things, actually forbid nurses to share information with the public.
That's why you get those teachers who get sort of pushed along from one school to another school to another school. And you know, how many murders can a nurse commit before somebody takes it seriously? It's not a joke.
Yeah, well, and we saw it in the case in Ontario.
Yes.
With regard to whistleblowers, David, what's the solution to the problem, at least in these extreme cases where a person in a workplace happens to become aware of some wrongdoing or some problem or something that's going to harm either the people in that workplace or the public? What kind of protection? Are there examples elsewhere? As to, you had mentioned that Canada sort of ranks at the bottom.
Right.
What could be done?
Well, we've got, as a society, we've got more than 40 years of experience of this, particularly in the USA, where they've had laws since 1977. And those laws are constantly under attack by wrongdoers who want to find ways to get around them. And they're constantly strengthened. So there's a lot of knowledge out there about what you need to put in place. And this can become very legal, get into lots of detailed legalese, which I'll not go there. The bottom line is that as soon as someone comes forward with a concern of some sort, you need to put an iron ring of protection around them so that it's people could be punished for taking reprisals against them. You know, a recent development is to establish a duty of protection on management of the organization, that it's their responsibility to make sure that nothing bad happens to that person, and they can be sanctioned if they fail. That's the kind of law that you can have in place, and there's lots more ingredients to that. Basically, you want to ensure due process, and due process soon weeds out troublemaker type of situations from situations where someone has something valuable to report, and focus attention on the message, not the messenger. What is it this person has to say, and if it's true, you know, where does that take us? there's a trend internationally to establish whistleblower laws. The number of countries that have them is going up exponentially. And last year, the European Union published a directive, so-called directive, on whistleblowing, which requires all member countries to establish national whistleblower laws that are in compliance with this directive. And it's an extremely well-written, comprehensive, well-designed directive. Organizations like GAP, Government Accountability Project in Washington, DC, they're the pioneering organization in this field. They have a 20-point criteria that they use to examine any kind of legislative system. And they give 18 points out of 20 to the European directive. A lot of countries are...
How many points does Canada get for its federal whistleblowing law?
Well, Tom was interviewed recently on CBC Radio, and he said that Canada was the only country they'd examined that didn't comply with any of the 20, not a single one. There's a report coming out from a GAP in the next month or so, which looks at a whole range of countries and evaluates them. And we're down there alongside Pakistan. You know, it's quite extraordinary. We're known internationally as the Titanic of whistleblower protection, mainly because in the first years of the program, the first commissioner was obviously very hostile to whistleblowers. And in her first 3 years, she found 0 cases of wrongdoing and 0 cases of reprisal in the entire federal public service. And she was ultimately had to resign and was discredited with a very, very harsh report from the Auditor General, which revealed that she had been basically engaging the kind of misconduct, reprisals and so on, that she was supposed to be driving out of the public service. And nothing has happened since. We have the same law, we have the same types of individuals put in charge of the agency that's supposed to protect whistleblowers. And we're a laughingstock because of that, unfortunately.
Well, Charles, you had been talking about the rights of public sector workers versus private, and I think you made a passing comment that it may be even more restrictive in the public sector. Could you comment a little more on that?
Well, I was going to pick up on what David said about...
Okay, please, go ahead.
No, but, you know, because I think the due process is so important, right? When it comes to workplace discipline, and that's, I think, the benefit. So, like, you know, in terms of answers, what would be a great answer? Well, every worker should have a union. And if every worker had a union, they would have a voice to protect them. They would have a process.
But can I challenge you a little bit on that?
Yeah, of course.
Not that every worker shouldn't have a union, but in a sense, the union can only grieve a violation of the collective agreement.
Yep.
So you need a union, presumably, to get collective agreement protections.
Yeah, well, the reason I say that is because, I mean, and this is, if you don't mind me, Jim, plugging the database we've constructed.
Please tell, you might tell people about that.
So we've constructed a database of every arbitration case and court case, mostly arbitration cases we've been able to find, dealing with some form of worker discipline through freedom of expression, primarily through social media, but some earlier ones that deal with pre-social media periods. And one of the interesting things about that, and a lot of them come from the public sector, David, and, you know, a lot of them deal with how so let me step back. Every arbitration decision that I've read, and it's almost 100 of them now, is that unions provide an incredible service to their members, even if it's egregious speech that we would all find offensive, right? Because, of course, they legally have to support their member, even if the member does some really horrible things, says some horrible things. And they try and grieve any kind of discipline, whether it's dismissal, whatever, some sort of punishment or non-dismissal, which usually leads to 10 or 15 days off or whatever. But what's interesting about that is every decision I've read is arbitrators will filter their decision through how the employee's behavior has affected the employer. So the entire system is structured in a way to filter the question of employee rights, in this case, freedom of expression, through how that expression has affected the employer's reputation. And, so if you look at some cases, if a public servant has said something and identifies as a public servant and, is wearing a t-shirt that says, I'm a firefighter or a police, whatever, then it's more likely they'll be disciplined because that is a direct harm to the employer. But every question about this that comes through is, how does it affect the employer's reputation? And that will be the decision. So on that scale, if it affected it a lot, there's a good chance the employee will be dismissed. If it affected it just a little bit, there might be some sort of remedy that's, you know, applicable. If it didn't affect it at all, the employee has a chance of you know, being reinstated and not being disciplined. So I find that fascinating, that it's that due process that makes this decision. Because in our database, all we have is access to decisions from unionized firms. In the private sector with no union, we have no capacity to know. So that means we're oversampling the public sector, because the public sector in Canada is so heavily represented by unions, whereas in the private sector that is not. And it shocks me that the unions are not more proactive on whistleblower protection. I was going to ask David how that plays out when it comes to, like, say, you know, in the PSAC or QP or some of these big public sector unions, which have to defend their members who might be blowing the whistle. I was curious if you could maybe expand on that.
Yeah, let me talk to that. Some unions, there are cases where the union's done an absolutely sterling job of defending the whistleblower and spending lots of money. Dr. Shiv Chopra was a case where the union PIPs defended him for years and years.
You might just explain what his case was.
Yeah,
very important.
He was one of the Health Canada scientists who disclosed to the Senate committee that basically that hormone, BSE, I think,
that was given to cattle to
was entering the food chain. That's right, and therefore, you know, not only damaging the cattle but polluting the food supply. So he lost a job because of that, and two other scientists with him. So the union defended him vigorously for years, and there are cases since that I could also cite. However, you know, when I think of the 400 people that I've spoken to, in many, many cases, the union was actually complicit with the employer. And I struggle to understand that. I think that some of the factors I can identify are that unions like to work on issues that will benefit the whole workforce, and spending a whole lot of money and effort on one individual case may not seem very attractive. I think they tend to, they may also enter into sort of deals where they trade off, you know, one favor for another, you know, maybe get a better deal in the collective agreement if I can make some of these other problems go away. I don't know. I'm not very familiar with unions, but it's been strange to me to see the whole gamut. You know, so many cases where they've really failed the employee, and a few cases where they've done a wonderful job.
I think it's in the public sector that you see most union engagement, and certainly both the public service employees union, PSAC, and also PIPS, the other big federal public sector union, have both made strong commitments around getting better whistleblowing legislation, and have run into a brick wall with the government in persuading them to do that. It is a real challenge. You know, I mean, if we go back to what Charles was starting to say about one thing to do is have a union. So if you are threatened with dismissal for what you've said, you have some protection, someone to fight to make it more difficult. But I assume in the absence of a union to do that, it goes back to what you said at the beginning, Charles, that effectively you have no rights.
Not that,
that the employer, I mean, as long as the employer dismisses you without cause and pays you your severance, that's the end of the story.
And, you know, it's interesting when you go to labor law conferences and you get the perspective from both sides, and, you know, you kind of, when this topic comes up, and, you know, the management lawyers will say, listen, as long as the employer has a policy, the policy, it needs to be there to protect your organization and to make it even easier for you to discipline your employee. So the policy advice that management side lawyers will give to employers is, here's the way to protect yourself from your employee behavior, and here's how you can more easily dismiss employees that speak their mind. And so it's, the whole structure is set up against employees and their ability to speak out. And, you know, it has to be said, and that, you know, employees will say things that are positive, as I think is the strong case, and sometimes they'll say things that are really are egregious and, you know, need to be criticized, because when you poison the work environment, if you're making comments about another employee, well, that can be really problematic. But in the literature, there's some really interesting discussions about whether firing and giving that power to the employer is equitable and actually solves the problem, or, you know, if there's better ways to remedy it. And, you know, I see in one of the comments questions about the role of university professors.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in a moment.
Yeah, I just want to add that, like, one of the things that I think unions need to start taking seriously is actually bargaining into their agreements, right? Similar things that university professors have around academic freedom, right? The capacity to actually speak out and actually be protected by it, right? In these agreements.
Yeah, we're gonna get to that issue.
Yeah, I know I didn't want to take away from that question, but I just wanted to add to that, you know, in some ways, university professors are privileged when it comes to their capacity to speak. But I think the reason we've been able to get that in our collective agreement, and we have really a language in ours at the University of Saskatchewan and at St. Thomas More College where I work, and I think part of that is because it's tied to our profession, right? Academic inquiry can be challenging. Now, if you can make the same arguments for every job, I think you're in a good place. But we need to. I think we could probably expand on that. But I know Dan had something to say there, and I don't want to take away from what she had to say.
But in the fact, we all have almost the opposite happening, as the Strom case indicated. I mean, presumably doctors or nurses that see wrongdoing have an in the workplace or in the long-term care facility or in the hospital have an obligation to do something about it, a professional, ethical obligation.
But Jim,
but can be disciplined if they do, as Carolyn Strom was.
Jim, the people also sign on to agreements that say they will do nothing that will bring the profession into disrepute. And that is defined very, very broadly in medicine, in law, in education. Not, I mean, you know, universities are unique.
Yeah, we'll get to the university example, but your point is generally in most other workplaces.
But you can see that, you know, for example, that, you know, the story that people were following this past week of the woman making vile racist accusations and calling the police in Central Park, you know, and who subsequently lost her job in a bank, in a financial institution. People were saying, well, you know, what does one thing have to do with the other? Well, the bank clearly felt that she brought the profession into disrepute by her behavior that went viral. And many people are entirely in favor of being able to have a reach that far, a reach that says, you know, we must protect our profession. And whistleblowers aside, you know, we have to be looked upon, you know, as being, you know, holier than thou. You know, I have to tell you, I'm having a problem right now. And my problem is that we're a bunch of white people of privilege talking about an issue that is profoundly affecting people who don't look like us. And, you know, people are saying things, they're out protesting, they're really telling the world, you know, the problems that you face as an academic, that's nice. But, you know, what about in the real world where we will lose our jobs? We have lost our jobs. And expression, you know, what do you think happens to people who have been arrested for protesting? May have nothing to do with their workplace. You know, several years ago, when Rob Ford was running for re-election as the mayor of Toronto, it was on a hot summer's day, and a man ran by without a shirt on, and he yelled something about, you know, down with Rob Ford, something to that effect, nothing obscene. And he was a teacher, it turned out. And the Ford family wanted to get him dismissed as a teacher because they felt that he brought the profession into disrepute. And they said nobody should have a teacher who, first of all, is seen without a shirt on. It was a man. You know, and expresses a political opinion. You know, what this guy went through, I don't know, because it never made it as far as the disciplinary actions. But, you know, we see that the whole protection of employers is much greater as a universal issue for people who don't look like us. And I'm deeply concerned about this.
But if anything, that's the reason that Charles was saying what we need is broader unionization, and David was saying we need laws that apply In the absence of that, everybody's vulnerable, and if you're marginalized, you're even more so.
Yeah.
You know, but you know, you were mentioning, and Charles made reference to it, and I'd just like to ask Charles, with regard, how has social media changed all this? I mean, in the past, it was what you did in the workplace, or in the case of Malcolm Ross, the example you were giving, Danielle, he was publishing stuff, handing out pamphlets, and so people became aware of it. But now we're all publishers, and we can reach tens of thousands of people in an instant. What impact is that having on restrictions on speech?
Well, I think you know, I think incredible ones, and ones that we're still thinking through. And you know, my colleague Daniel Mclaughlin at the University of Ottawa is a communication scholar, and one of the reasons we teamed up or partnered is because I think the communication angle of this is so important to think about how voices are amplified in the current context, and you know, sometimes for positive reasons and sometimes for negative ones. But I think, you know, for our purposes, what it means is that historically, where you might have had a buffer zone between your employer, you know, and all employment relations are a microcosm of power relations in society more general. And I agree with everything Danielle said about how those power relations, you know, affect different groups differently. So men or women, racialized people or not. But in the workplace now, you don't have that moment where you're away from the workplace. Essentially, you're now always in the workplace. If you have any presence online, right, you basically are always a worker. Now, how closely you identify with that employment relationship in your social media profile or in your public life does matter, right? When you read the arbitrator decisions, they sure get into the weeds with like, well, how closely did you identify? Were you wearing a T-shirt that said you worked for this person or whatever? And the more you can identify, the more the arbitrator will side with the employer as a general rule. Again, I'm generalizing a little bit, but it seems to be a blurring of the public and private, which I think, you know, there's always been a blurring of the public and private. But I think what the social media realm does is it brings it into this sort of connotation that, you know, where there's power imbalances, they will be amplified through social media. And I think that's an interesting way to think about how it's affecting people at work. Your boss has power over you, and that power will be amplified because now your boss can monitor you. And if you are saying things that affect the boss, even if it's just, you know, as innocuous as we can do better, the boss has the power now to discipline you for something like that. And I think that shrinking of the space has broad implications over all kinds of things: surveillance, you know, existing racism or sexism in workplaces. All of these things, I think, are being amplified in an era where, well, let's be honest. I mean, we're doing something we couldn't have done 10 years ago, Jim. We're having this broad conversation being witnessed by dozens, hundreds, thousands of people. And, you know, what we say is going to reach far more people than if we were just sitting in a classroom with, you know, 30 or 40 participants in the room. And you know, this is an example of that. But, you know, even more so is when, you know, someone's at 2 o'clock in the morning and tweets out something innocuously, and suddenly they don't have a job the next day. So I think it's a real big issue, and one that, you know, the literature is touching on. And, you know, but, you know, when you talk to arbitrators or when you talk to lawyers, they're like, oh, the issue's settled. We know what to do now. It's all settled. And it's not clear to me that it is.
I'm going to go to Danielle in a minute. I just want to remind anyone in the audience, we're going to come to you in just a minute. If you have any questions that you would like to ask the panel, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you move your cursor to the bottom of your screen, you can just write out your questions. She'll go to Anne's Holmes and she'll share with us. I'm sorry, Danielle, you were wanting to comment.
Oh, I just said that your tweets will make a difference unless you happen to be the president of the United States, in which case it will be amplified and amplified and amplified.
Yes. Well.
Now, Charles, you had mentioned, I just wanted to pick up one other thing for our audience. You had mentioned that you've compiled as many arbitration decisions as could be found on the subject of workplace free expression. Can you tell people how they can get access to that database, because it's publicly available through our website?
Yeah, so at the Center for Free Expression, we've made it available as a searchable database. You can look up keywords, and we tried to be creative with the keywords because, you know, it's for public sector, social media, Twitter, these kind of things. So if you're looking for examples to this and you want to do some work on it or just get a sense of what's happening out there, it's not a bad microcosm of what's happening in the broader society in Canada. Now, part of the plan is we hope to expand it to bigger centers, so Canada, the US, the UK, and to Europe, in the sense that this is happening everywhere, and it'll be interesting to see how it's shaping worker relationships in different parts of the world. And, you know, in the age of COVID-19 and all the social unrest we're witnessing now, I think you're starting, you know, you see a presence in amplifying these microcosms of history, and it really is going to have broader social implications. So that little database, I think, gives you a nice sense of like the issues that are happening in the workplace and that will be happening in the workplace as we go forward.
So if you go to cfe.ryerson.ca and click on issues and choose workplace expression, it'll take you right to the database. And you can also search for whatever decisions there were in your province or in the area in which you work. So it's an easy database to use, thanks to the hard work of Charles and Danielle.
And the center.
Well, we had the easy part. David, were you wanting to say something about this before I go to the audience?
Yeah, I'd just like to add, while on the subject of other information and resources, again, on the CFE website, if you drill down into the whistleblowing section, then you'll find some very useful stuff. You'll find information about what typically happens to whistleblowers. You'll find guidance. You'll find an analysis that we conducted of the federal legislation, which explains in great detail why it's so completely ineffective. And you'll also find some criteria that we've recently developed, which set out what are the key elements of a strong system to protect whistleblowers. What does that have to look like? So lots of good stuff to look at if someone is interested in learning more.
Okay. Well, Ange, we're going to go to the audience now. Ange, could you share the first question you have?
Yeah, the first question is from Carolyn Sale, and it's, could we hear more about how to make workplaces, unionized workplaces at least, more like the kind of special workplaces professors inhabit? What would it take?
So who would like to describe, first of all, Charles, you were starting to go into this and I was cautioning you because we were going to make it a separate thing. What is it in an academic collective agreement that protects free expression rights for faculty?
So in pretty much every academic contract in Canada, because Canada has by far the most unionized sectors in academia, not all of the university sector in other countries in the US and the UK and others are unionized the way Canada is. There are some universities that are not, but for the most part across the country, we have a heavily unionized university setting.
I think it's over 90%.
That's right. And, you know, and of course we have broad organizations like the CAUT, which helps, you know, provide advice. But basically what every collective agreement has, and it's usually the first or second clause in any academic collective agreement, is an academic freedom clause, which basically says for academic research, academics have to be able to ask the broad social questions, many of which will be controversial, many of which are going to be polarizing. That's not the language, I'm paraphrasing. But for academic inquiry to actually have merit, right? Academics have to be free from social punishment to do that academic inquiry. So, you know, the conversation that the center is hosting next week on anti-Semitism and you know, the debate you're having, forget the name of it, Jim. I mean, I think to not have some sort of protection in that debate, academics would, you to have that protection is important, to have a free discussion about what that means. And I think that's the kind of idea, to ask questions, to do critical research, to sort of push the agenda in different areas. And, you know, and that includes, and that's interesting, and not everybody will know this, is that in an academic freedom clause, often it gives academics the capacity to criticize their employer.
Almost always.
So part of academic freedom is the capacity to say, well, my employer is doing something that's limiting my ability to do my job. And to me, well, when I first saw that, I remember being, wow, like that's really interesting. And it's like, why don't more unions have that for their employees? Because sometimes their employers could do something similar. And I thought that was really fascinating to think about, that there could be this capacity for unions to bargain the ability of workers to speak out generally, but also to criticize their employer in a way that would be, you know, sort of beneficial. Because obviously you don't have the right to slander your employer, to make up lies. And I mean, you still have these restrictions. And I think those are important, but you have the capacity to say, the employer's doing X, it's hurting us in this way, and we need to do better. And, you know, I think that's an interesting way to think about what future agreements could include, or what, you know, in David's case, future laws could include for potential whistleblowers, or in Danielle's case for teachers who, you know, I think have similar restrictions, but, you know, don't have the protections that academics do.
I mean, the origins of that, of academic freedom language, are really the notion that if a teacher is going to educate their students, they have to have the freedom to use their best professional judgment in addressing the questions in that classroom. And if they're beholden to conventional views at the time, or to the power of a wealthy donor, or of a current university president, or of a powerful member of the Board of Governors, then they won't be fulfilling their obligations to their students. And they won't be able to ask the difficult questions that will advance our knowledge. And it even has this, and I just have in mind David's comments about whistleblowing, the business about, in virtually every collective agreement, there's protection in the university for making critical comments about any aspect of your workplace. Positive comments, negative comments. And it grows out of the notion that the workplace is better, that nobody knows the workplace better than the people who actually work in it. And the tradition in university is that academics collectively govern their institutions. And therefore, everybody who participates in the governance should have a right to speak about it. But, you know, if one extends that logic to any workplace, how, if you see something wrong in your workplace, or if you see something can be made better, does it hurt the workplace to allow you to speak about that? So, I mean, that logic, I mean, I don't know if there's anything like this, Danielle, in K to 12
No, there
situations.
isn't. And I think one of the things that we're looking at is, you know, cui bono. Who is it that benefits? I think that it isn't terribly difficult to make an argument that university students, who are the fee payers, benefit from academic freedom as much as the people who are teaching them. When you look at the K to 12 system, you're looking at children. And when people say one of our first obligations with children is to protect them, we need to protect them and we need to educate them both. Well, these often come into conflict, the protection and the education, but the greatest focus is often on the protection of children. So people will say things like, well, we're not sure what the effect of reading The Merchant of Venice will be on the grade 12 class, but we sure aren't going to let the grade 11s read it because, you know, it could be just too strong for them. They won't be able to understand it. So we're protecting the children. And I don't think we're going to see much change because teachers aren't, on the whole, not trusted. They're not trusted by the system and they're not trusted by the families of the children who attend them. And so people want to see controls. They don't believe that teachers can use their creativity in safe, and I'm going to, you know, keeping children safe. One of the weird things, I was in a faculty of education, and there was a questionnaire circulated among the teacher candidates, people about to become teachers, and they asked them, what do teachers do? And almost none of them came up with teach. You know, well, we have to protect children. We have to, you know, we have to, you know, all of this language around equity and you know, which is very important. But the idea that your first thing to do is teach, it's gone. It's not there any longer. So I don't think we're going to see this kind of protection, at least certainly not in my lifetime, and probably not in that of my grandchildren.
David, you spent much of your career as a management consultant. Is there anything in management consultant world about the notion of the value of getting the workers' perspectives on things?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, there are criteria out there for effective ways of managing an organization and competitive processes whereby people apply and organizations apply and can receive awards. And part of that is looking at how they manage people. And I'll give two contrasting approaches. There's the approach which we'll all recognize where people are viewed as a cost. They're viewed as all potential thieves and troublemakers and so on that must be kept in line. they're viewed as unintelligent, or at least only intelligent as far as their own interests are concerned. And so it's management's job to do all the intelligent thinking and to tell people what to do and make sure that they do it. Another view is that the employees know more about the business in many ways than management, that they are motivated through pride and self-respect to make sure that they do a good job for the customer. And their intelligence is a valuable resource to be tapped to devise more efficient ways of doing things. And of course you can inculcate those different approaches in your human resources policies and practices. And I worked in the field of quality management, and we can probably all remember the time when the car industry was in shock in North America because people just started buying Japanese cars because they were much more reliable. And that was one of the reasons that the Asian country, Japan in particular, had done a wonderful job of reaching out to employees, making them part of the process, actually teaching them in what I'd call industrial engineering techniques to study their own processes and make them better. And as a result, they could make cars way cheaper than North America. And moreover, the cars that were reliable and worked properly. So that's a lesson for, but you see, this comes down to the mentality of senior management. And as we well know, there's a reasonable proportion of people in senior positions of power who are sociopaths or tending in that direction. And they tend to believe that other people are motivated in the same way that they are. And so, they're much more likely to turn to harassment, bullying, those sorts of control methods to advance their own interests and to get other people to do what they want. Those sorts of people are never going to go down this management path. But there are some really enlightened leaders I've seen do this with amazing business results.
Ange, can we go to the next question and then we'll come back to the panel? Ange?
Yeah. I got an anonymous question. Danielle, you talked about how different this sort of situation and conversation is for marginalized folk, particularly racialized people. What do you think could be done to help protect those that are marginalized but are not protected by contracts and collective agreements?
That's a really big question, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to look at employment policies that look at, who do we have here and who are we listening to? And so long as we're only listening to the usual suspects, we're in some trouble. I think unions really do help the situation, particularly in certain kinds of workplaces. But I worry about, people, racialized people, LGBTQ people in professions as well. Even though they don't tend to be unionized, they do tend to be treated poorly. If you look at what's happening, for example, with COVID-19 and healthcare workers who tend to be racialized people and women, they're in a terrible situation. And they're also, like the nurse that you described, they are in difficulty if they speak out about their working conditions. So, what can we do about that? I think strong unions have to be put into place, and I think we have to be alert to the fact that not everybody is on the same table. As some people are far more at risk. If you look at policing, for example, some of us can blithely walk down the street while others of us are going to be stopped just because of the way we appear. This is true of workers. Some workers are going to be held to a standard that's totally unreasonable, likely because of their race, their gender, their sexuality. And we have to feed these things in, I think, into contracts to say to the employers, yes, you want to protect your workplace. Yes, you want to protect your clientele or your students, but you have to be protecting the people who work for you and ensure that they are treated equitably. And that's not easily done. But, you know, human rights legislation hasn't been with us that long. You know, it's certainly within my lifetime, and I'm not yet 100 years old. And, you know, we are still working out the fuzzy bits, and it's going to take a long time. But, you know, please, let's have more of it.
Charles, in the database where you've collected the arbitrations, do you get a sense of how race and gender may play into these decisions?
I mean, that's a really big question. I think it does, and you see it, I think, in different ways. But to my knowledge, I can't think of a case that was sort of about that particular issue. But I thought Danielle's answer was just fantastic. And, you know, one of the things about, you know, so you'll often hear, you know, that, you know, unions have had a place in society. That time has passed. Now we have sort of more equitable relations, and there's employment standards legislation and these sort of things. And one of the problems is, and I think the database cases show this, is that, you know, you're not going to get governments putting resources into enforcing, you know, occupational health and safety rules. You're not going to get advanced human rights protections unless there's organizations pushing for it. And, you know, the thing that, you know, unions help to do is empower those people who need it the most, right? So they allow people to push back again and collectively say, enough is enough, right? And, you know, governments that make it harder to form unions often say, well, we need to do that so we can maintain competitiveness and, you know, economic, but they often forget about the reasons why a lot of workers form unions. It was because they were being treated very poorly, and not just, you know, they weren't being paid well, though that's obviously an issue, but, you know, they were being discriminated against. They were being passed over for promotions. They were just being treated like a commodity. And, you know, one of the things you see in these arbitration cases, Jim, and I hope I'm reflecting the comments Danielle makes, I agreed with everything she said, was that, you know, the union was able to put forward defenses for unionized workers in a way that I think reflected the arguments that they were telling the arbitrator, the individual worker was telling the arbitrator. So the individual worker was empowered, not just the union lawyer speaking for the worker, if that makes sense. Now that's not true in every case, but you really do notice worker voice amplified in these cases. And you know, sometimes the employee behavior was not good, but their voice was heard. And I thought that was actually an interesting part of this idea of what a real due process would look like, David, if we were taking this issue really seriously.
Can I just interject one other thing?
Sure.
The collection of race-based data, the time has come. I think, you know, I don't know if your database includes that. I suspect it doesn't. But I would be very interested to know about people who were penalized for expression. I know that discipline in schools in many areas where they were forced to collect race-based data, it shows very clearly that people far out of their proportion in the population are being disciplined if they belong to racialized minorities, yeah, or if they have a disability. Okay. I strongly suspect you would find this in workplace discipline as well. We just haven't been collecting the data, and I think we need to collect a great deal of data. So, you know, how do you complain about something when you can't prove it exists?
That's a really good point too, because the Canadian Labor Force Survey, which produces basically everything we do on labor, all the labor data we get is through the Canadian Labor Force Survey and through Stats Canada, and you can find all kinds of things about unions, the age demographic, the gender demographic. You can't find the racial demographic. We don't know the composition of unions based on race or workforces based on race, because as Danielle pointed out, we don't collect that information. So I agree completely. We need to have better data collection to really get to the heart of these problems.
And I assume that the workplace free expression database of the arbitration cases doesn't allow you to search by race.
No, well, we don't know. I mean,
that's what I'm saying. You don't know what it is. It is not
there's been arbitration cases that have someone has been the victim of racist language, so you can sort of come to some assumptions based on that. But really, unless it's been identified as the sole cause of the discussion of the discipline, yeah, we don't know. We wouldn't know.
Okay, Ange, another question?
Yeah, this is a question that I think has been talked about already, but maybe you can say more. An anonymous attendee says, I understand that university professors have immunity of a sort regarding their freedom to voice their opinions, no matter how controversial they may be. Is this actually the case, or are they also unable to speak freely? And if university professors have this immunity, why don't teachers in elementary and secondary school have the same rights? Isn't this necessary for a decent intellectual education, let alone it's being necessary for learning and democracy?
Actually, can I abuse the role of moderator to respond? Because in my earlier life, I was the executive director of the Canadian Association of University Teachers.
We expected, Jim.
And that was always my view. I mean, there's no immunity. It's just there's a protection that in using your best professional judgment about how to teach or what to research or what to say about what's happening where you work, you can't be constrained or restricted because somebody might be offended by what you're saying, whether it be a donor, as I was saying earlier, or an alumnus, a wealthy alumnus, or the board of governors, or the head of the local business association. That those kinds of considerations shouldn't come into making educational decisions, whether what's taught, what's researched, or how the organization is run. I never understood why that's now almost universal in universities, but not the case in elementary and secondary schools.
Well, I think,
Or in fact, in every other workplace. I mean, why shouldn't people have those kinds of rights to participate collectively in the operation of where they work without punishment?
you know, I think if you look at what teachers do, you might be able to see that there is a difference. I'm not arguing that there shouldn't be a protection for expression, but a lot of the in-school stuff has to do with teachers calling kids racist names, you know, discipline for swearing at children. I don't think that would be or should be covered by freedom of expression.
No, nor is it covered by academic freedom.
No, but
right? I mean, as a faculty member, Charles or I do not have the right to treat somebody in a discriminatory fashion, to harass them, to threaten them, or any of the other exclusions. So academic freedom does not extend to that kind of illegal behavior. We don't have the academic freedom to defame people. So we're not talking about those kind of abuses.
I understand, but when people think about teachers, that is what they think about. And I think that they don't see teachers, for example, as researchers. They don't see them as anything except people who are delivering a specific curriculum. And people often say, well, just teach me the facts, or just teach me what's in the curriculum. I'm not interested in anything else. Or, you know, is this on the test? So, you know, until teachers are seen as being creative professionals who, you know, use their ingenuity to enlighten people and get them involved, we're not going to see that. Should we see it? I'd be delighted to see it, but we'll see.
Well, one of my best friends is a retired kindergarten teacher, and she spent most of her adult life researching and thinking and strategizing about how effectively to teach her kindergarten kids. Now, it seems to me that's as much research and scholarship as what goes on in a university or in terms of figuring out how to teach. And that should be protected. And that commitment and professional judgment should be protected in some way. I think that's the argument for academic freedom and extending it more broadly. Well, Ange, do you have another question for us? I think this will be probably the last one.
Yeah, so the next question is, if we agree that speech is one of the most important things that makes us human, for workers not to have free speech in the workplace is for them to risk being dehumanized at work. From that perspective, is there not an ethical imperative to ensure workers have workplace free expression? And an equally great ethical imperative to disallow workplaces where the very nature of the work is so reductive that there is little room for speech at all?
Who would like to address that one? I look to you, Charles, since this is the area in which you do your work.
Yes. There's a great book, and the name of the author is just eluding me at the moment. I have it somewhere in this pile beside me, but it's called Private Government. And it's from an American author who makes the argument that, you know, so much of our lives are dictated by employers now, and yet they're the least accountable of the institutions to which we are forced to interact with in a democratic society. And it's, in some ways it's true. I mean, you don't have to work, but if you don't, your material conditions will deteriorate to the point where you can't really exist in this society. So we have to interact with employers. And in that book, the author of Private Government, I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the author, but I can forward it to the question, the person asking the question.
Presumably anybody could Google private government.
Yeah, and I thought it was a fascinating argument to say, like, actually, if we look at democratic theory, one of the foundations of our society is to be able to question those who have power. And employers have power, and yet we don't actually recognize it through through government or any other ways. And maybe this is full circle, but Danielle's comments about the charter made me think about this thought that I sometimes say in my charter class is that let's imagine that the charter applied to every institution in society. Would that be really radical? And I think it would, although it shouldn't be, right? Because those are rights that Canadians will say most of the time that they support that, glowingly. And yet we don't actually allow that in that document. Not that it's perfect, it's certainly not. But we don't actually allow that document to actually dictate how institutions are run in most cases. So I think the point is right, and it's not something we talk about a lot because we see it as, well, that's the boss's equipment, so of course I can't use it for any other reason than to do my job, or no, of course it's okay for them to tell me I can't say certain things, and of course it's okay to enforce a dress code that tells me what I have to wear to work. Like all of these things, right, are just something that I think we normalize, and I think that's one of the questions at the heart of the work is, and I think we all address it in different ways. And someone's telling me, Elizabeth Anderson, author of Private Government. Thank you, Danielle McLaughlin. I appreciate that. Anyway, it's a really fascinating point, and I think one we're thinking about in more detail. So I'm rambling now. I apologize.
Any other comment on that one? Do we have a quick moment for another question, Ange? Do you have a short one there?
Yes, another question from Barry. Would one consider union and management as a relationship that reflects and enables corporate complicity?
I asked you for a short question. We could have a whole panel on that one.
Doesn't it depend on the union?
David, do you have a response?
Oh, I think I alluded to seeing examples of that where, I felt the union was a bad actor, in the way they, sided with the employer when they shouldn't have. And I don't really understand all the reasons that may happen.
But you also know of the opposite example. Certainly a lot of employers talk about the union in a way that suggests that they don't view it as complicit with them.
No, that's right. That's right. And it may not be in every case. I mean, as I said, the union may be more inclined to go to battle with the employer over things that affect the whole workforce, whereas they may not be so inclined to do so if it seems to be an issue around just one employee.
Well, and the key thing is, as we were talking about earlier, the union can defend the rights that it has negotiated in a collective agreement. So going back to what Charles said at the very beginning, given the basis of employment law, employers essentially have almost all the rights except those that are limited by statute, by contract, or by collective agreement. So even where there's something unfair that's happening, if there's nothing in the collective agreement that prevents that from being done by the employer, the union has a restricted right to do much about it.
Yeah, and corporate complicity is a big word. I mean, like the Canadian Auto Workers before they were Unifor had a really, really encompassing environmental policy where they pushed for, programs that would, recycle cars and limit emissions and move toward. I mean that's not something that they had to do because they could have just said, well, let the auto companies do whatever. But good unions, I think, find ways that can, sort of build on the values of their members. Now, not all unions are good unions, and there might be a too close a relationship with the employer that, could weaken the rights of members. That's all true. But if the issue is how do we amplify employee voice, the best institution we have is unionization. It's not a perfect one. There are problems. They are democratic organizations that are accountable to their membership. And I think they bring those values to the table. I think that's the argument I was certainly trying to make. And I hope that was reflected.
Well, we've come to the end of our panel for tonight. I want to thank our panelists, David Hutton, Danielle Mclaughlin, and Charles Smith, for a very lively discussion. I hope that the audience appreciated it as well. And I'd also like to remind everyone that our next Center for Free Expression panel will be a week tomorrow. That is Wednesday, June 10th. It's going to be at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And it's going to be quite a controversial issue: fighting anti-Semitism or silencing critics of Israel. What's behind the push for governments to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism? So with that, again, thanks to our panel, and thank you to the audience. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.